Welcome to the Ghostly Gallery podcast, a place where we explore the world of horror and mystery in film, television, books, and popular culture. Well, greetings, everyone. Welcome to the latest edition of the show. My name is Bruce Markison. As always, I'm joined by co-host and executive producer, I should say, Tracy Asteria. Tracy, what's new with you?
Well, thank you for the promotion, Bruce.
Yeah, we've added all these other, smaller producers that don't get any credit. So we've kind of raised you up. Actually, I'm just completely making this up. You're the only producer, and you have been our only producer since day number one of the show. Something that we greatly appreciate. Anyway, how are you doing, Tracy?
I'm doing good. I'm so happy that January has finally come to a close, which is great. And it was such a long month and cold. It's still cold, but that's fine.
Yeah.
And and I just kind of wanted to give a very special thanks once again to Maria with Maria and T and Telly. Just to let everybody know, Bruce and I had a great conversation with her just this past Thursday night on her YouTube channel. And we had so much fun talking about the Ghostly Gallery podcast. And if anybody's interested in watching, the link will be the description at the below of this video and this audio podcast. So everybody can check it out and take a watch. It was a great evening.
Yeah, it was fun. It was a great opportunity to talk about what we do here, promote our podcast. Maria's pretty popular, so we're always grateful for that opportunity. Yeah, that was a nice thing that Maria did for us, so we do appreciate that. So, Tracy, this week's show, we are going to be discussing the legendary Scottish author, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He, of course, created one of the most famous characters in literature and really in popular culture. And that, of course, is Sherlock Holmes. He gave us 56 short stories and 4 full-length novels involving the famed detective. And it's just a wonderful library, if you will, of stories. I recently purchased my own copy. And on the YouTube version, I'll hold up a copy of this. It's a very thick book. It's about 1,200 pages, pretty small print, but it has all 56 short stories and the 4 novels. It's all there. And I'd love to tell you that I read the entire book, all 1,200 pages, in preparation for this interview that we're going to be doing tonight. That would be slightly a lie, more than slightly a lie, but I did read quite a bit of the canon of Sherlock Holmes, as we call it, as given to us by the great Arthur Conan Doyle. And that certainly helped prepare to talk about our program today. Now, it's not as well known, but Conan Doyle, in addition to doing the Sherlock Holmes material, which is great, but he was also a writer who did venture into the world of horror and the world of supernatural. He was especially fascinated by the world of the occult. Some of the Holmes stories, and we're going to talk about a few of them, did feature elements of horror. They include the short story, The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire, and also the full-length book, The Hound of the Baskervilles, which has been made into a film on numerous occasions. Also, Doyle wrote many other stories outside of the Sherlock Holmes canon. He wrote about ghosts and vampires, mummies, werewolves, and human killers, too. Joining this week on the program to talk about this aspect of Conan Doyle's writing is a new friend of ours, Max Magee. Max is a scholar, a historian, and as they like to say in the trade, a Sherlockian. Max contributed to the Rosenbach Museum's recent series on A Christmas Carol. That's where I first became aware of Max's work and his expertise. And he comes highly recommended to us by our friend, Edward G. Pettit, who, of course, runs the Rosenbach's Gothic online offerings. We're very glad to have Max Magee with us. Max, welcome to the Ghostly Gallery. Thanks for being our guest tonight.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure.
As I said, Edward has said many good things about you, so I know you're not going to disappoint whatsoever. Edward would never steer me in the wrong direction. I've seen
I
some of
love
the
it, Ed.
work that you did. Yeah, you and Olivia Rutigliano provided some very wonderful guest commentary, color commentary on the Christmas Carol series, which recently did air through the Rosenbach offerings. It was really a lot of fun. And it was in watching those programs that I learned about your interest in Sherlock Holmes. We're going to get into a lot of these stories during the course of the next hour. First, kind of a general look at Sherlock Holmes. It's amazing what this fictional detective has done in terms of gaining a remarkable following. Nearly 100 years it continues after the death of Conan Doyle. There have been many other famous fictional detectives in literature: Hercule Poirot, Miss Marple, Philip Marlowe, Nancy Drew, the Hardy Boys. Those are just some. But Holmes is the most popular. He is the one who seems to be the king of the mountain. Why, Max, do you think he continues to hold our fascination all these decades later?
I think that's a question that is something that we still try to answer in the community currently today. I think it's a combination of the scene setting, the storytelling, and the characterizations. You imagine a character like Sherlock Holmes and his sidekick, companion, partner. We like to call, in my house, we call him Sherlock Holmes' heterosexual life partner. But they have a relationship that is familiar, like two cowboys out on the range is another example. I think of Lonesome Dove as this like great, cowboy romance that's, bromance. And that we Sherlockians and readers love visiting them when we get to read about the sitting room at 221B Baker Street. You imagine that you're there. You can hear the crackling of a fire in the fireplace. You want to sit in that wicker chair or one of those overstuffed wingbacks, and just light up a pipe, swirl your snifter of brandy, and just indulge in the world. And so it's in some ways a time machine. I like to call the Victorian era literature a virtual time machine, because we're putting ourselves back in that era. And it's an idealized picture, but it's also, we traverse into the underbelly. We go into the opium dens. We aren't just dealing with peers and royals, but we do on occasion, encounter a king of Bohemia or a certain gracious lady who remains unnamed.
So when did you become a fan of the Sherlock Holmes stories?
That's an interesting story. A lot of that's one of those things. How do you get to know a Sherlockian? Ask them when they first encountered Sherlock Holmes. And I encountered Sherlock Holmes when I was about 12 or 13, when my dad got me a paperback complete Sherlock Holmes. And initially I said, oh, I love Sherlock Holmes from the Granada series with Jeremy Brett, mystery. I was, in my teens, when like early teens, while it was still airing. And so I was aware of the Jeremy Brett series, but I didn't have any context for it.
Right.
So it was like any other mystery series where I just didn't understand the plot lines really. But one of my earliest introductions to Sherlock Holmes was through the Basil Rathbone films. And those also were on PBS, aired on TNT, I believe, as well, like, quite often. And at the time, I wasn't aware that there was this dramatic shift between the Victorian era and the World War II era Sherlock Holmes films. But I remember him being Victorian and wearing the Inverness cloak and the deerstalker hat. And so my Sherlock Holmes really at the very beginning was Basil Rathbone.
Oh, wow.
But in reading the stories, I never got hooked, because I opened them up, and the beginning of A Study in Scarlet, which is the one you start with when you just start cover to cover, is fascinating, but you're kind of left a little bit in the dark, and then suddenly it shifts to the great alkali plains of Salt Lake City, Utah, and you're in a desert, and there's sort of a story about a father and a daughter, and it's really not fun. And so I kind of just went, I'll pick that up later. And then it was another 25 years before I picked it up again. So I wasn't really
Wow.
a Sherlockian. I was a casual fan of Sherlock Holmes. It was one of those things that I had seen.
Mm.
And I think, I watched the BBC Sherlock series. I enjoyed parts of it, but I think kind of lost me after the beginning of the second season. And so I didn't really pick up that. I watched the Robert Downey Jr. movies. Those were fun, but they
Right.
weren't my Sherlock Holmes. They were action Sherlock. And so like by the end of the 20 teens, I would say probably 2017, 18, I had gone back and I said, I missed a lot of these Victorian authors that, are the great literature.
Mm.
And so I went deep on some Charles Dickens that I had given a pass to. Edwin Drood, I went so deep on Edwin Drood. Earlier I had read the Dune series and so I'm an omnivore reader.
Mhm.
And when I got to the Sherlock Holmes canon, as we say, this is an allusion to the biblical nature, and the analogy comes from Monsignor Ronald Knox, who was a Catholic priest in I believe it was 1910s, 20s, and he was making fun of the biblical spats that happened between different Catholic, scholars. And he said that the Sherlock Holmes canon was worthy of the same sort of scrutiny, and that all of the same issues apply to the canon of Sherlock Holmes, which at that time didn't include the latter half of the Sherlock Holmes stories, because they were yet to be written, I believe. Um, so yeah, I got into the canon by a website called thebestofsherlock.com that's run by Randall Stock. And Randall Stock is a great Sherlockian. He is a scholar. He is an evangelist for Sherlock Holmes. And I started because he keeps a list of ranked stories that originally Conan Doyle gave his 12 favorite stories, again, even before he had finished writing the canon. And then there were these surveys that would go out to the Sherlock Holmes fans in the United States. The biggest Sherlock Holmes fan group is called the Baker Street Irregulars, the BSI. And those were a group of street urchins, which, orphans or ne'er-do-well, like pickpockets, basically, that were Sherlock Holmes agents throughout London. And so he had his vast network of these inconspicuous children who, led by their Wiggins, their lead boy, um, would collect information for Sherlock Holmes, his agency, basically. And so, getting back to my story, because, I can't tell a short one. Randall Stock and the work that he did helped me find my favorite story of the Sherlock Holmes canon. The short story in particular, Silver Blaze, which I think is just one of the most well-constructed mysteries of all time. It's surprising, it's funny, it's entertaining. There's action around every corner. You have your theories and they're dashed. You have your other theory and they're, like you're led very, very masterfully through the story, and you think you know what happened and you're wrong. And so it's one of those ones that I like to point to as like, you got to read this before you know who Sherlock Holmes is and what the stories can do. Silver Blaze, Sign of Four, Scandal in Bohemia, Study in Scarlet, even, and The Speckled Band are my 5 S's that I say, you should read those 5, and then you'll really know who Sherlock Holmes is. And
Oh,
then, of
very
course,
cool.
Hound of the Baskervilles, which is one of my favorite all-time books, period. Not just mysteries, not just Sherlock Holmes, but I would put it up there as just one of the great adventure stories of all time. And it happens to be fantastic Gothic horror.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
That's a
cool.
perfect transition because that's the first story that we're going to talk about. It's a full-length book written in 1902. I'll give you a brief summary, and if I get anything wrong on this, please feel free to correct me, Max. But we'll get your thoughts on the book and what is particularly good about it. So it is the story of the Baskerville family. One of their ancestors, a man named Hugo, once kidnapped the daughter of a farmer. She then escaped from him. And while Hugo pursued her, he apparently put some kind of a curse on himself. Shortly thereafter, Hugo's friends found the girl dead and discovered that Hugo had been killed by a demonic hound. And this demonic hound is said to haunt the land known as Dartmoor, where the Baskervilles live. Legend has it that the hound is responsible for the premature deaths of many Baskerville family members. Then Holmes and Watson are asked to investigate the legend and the latest death that has occurred. So first question on this, Max, in reading this story or this full-length book, really, does he at any point believe the legend might be true, or does he maintain his skepticism? Does he look for logic and rationale at every point without losing it?
It is sort of left up to the reader's interpretation. However, there is a point, and it's one of the greatest cliffhangers of all time. Another reason that this is just such a great book. This was originally serialized between, I believe it was 1901, 1902. And so or was it 1900, 1901? I always get mixed up in those years. But chapter 1 ends with the line, "No, Mr. Holmes, they were the footprints of a gigantic hound." And so up until that point, you are right there with Holmes, like, okay, sure, this curse, yada, yada, who cares? Like, we're all skeptics, right? We go into this going, okay, yeah, ghost story, whatever. And then you realize that there is physical evidence of a monstrous being, right? So at that point, you have to sort of believe in the legend. I would, you said, correct you if you get anything wrong. It's not that the hound haunts Dartmoor. It's the hound is the curse that haunts the Baskerville family as a result of Sir Hugo's ill behavior. He was one of the most evilest, the evilest people in the Baskervilles family, and supposedly this bloodline is cursed as a result. He actually was killed by the hound. The hound was found ripping his throat out at that time, and that the woman, the daughter of the yeoman farmer, she died of fright, essentially. And that, yeah. So just a minor correction, because the curse is directly tied to Sir Henry Baskerville, who is the heir and the sort of protagonist of the story that Holmes is here to help. So your question is a really good one. It gets at the heart of what makes this story fun. And that is that we don't believe it until we do. And then how do you explain that? And there's, I don't know how deeply into spoiler territory you all go. But I can give a couple more details that make it basically, unimpeachable that the hound exists, right? That this cursed being, this demon dog, this devil spawn is a real thing. And that this is the closest that Sherlock Holmes has ever gotten to evil. And that there are, towards the end of the narrative of this story, there's a moment where they go out and they're like, well, we're going to kill this thing because it's probably just a dog. And suddenly it appears flaming in the night. Its eyes are glowing like with fire. Its mouth is ablaze. And so this is a real demonic being. And there's this fog closing in where Sir Henry is going to be killed by this demon dog. And it's like moments from disaster. And I get shivers just describing it, but it's just one of the greatest scene settings. And, the atmospherics of it all is so claustrophobic. even though you're out on this great moor, this great marshy, plain. But it's, there's elements of The Last Unicorn that always remind me of the moor, because the moor ponies disappear into the bog, never to be heard from again. And so whenever it's not Atreyu, I don't remember the name of the horse, but when the horse in The Last Unicorn is put in danger, anyway, that it reminds me of the Hound of the Baskervilles as well.
Mm-hmm. What you describe in the Hound of the Baskervilles, man, it sounds a lot like the 1941 film The Wolfman with Lon Chaney.
Yes. Yeah, a lot of the elements that I don't think Doyle invented them, because I think of Poe, I think of like some of the French authors, the Lecoq, as you mentioned. They'd done some of these things before, but the bringing it all together into this like sort of haunted mansion story, I think that the Hound of the Baskervilles is where we get a lot of those like Scooby-Doo tropes, where there's like a candlestick and a moving wall, and sorted just like people creeping around the house, and you never know who's listening through the fireplace that has two entrances. And these are tropes that we take for granted today, but like I don't know that I've seen them all put together sort of. And then there's this demonic being, supernatural being that you have to unravel. And so it's sort of a prototype of a lot of other horror that comes later, and it's about the place. You mentioned the Wolfman. One of the things that Doyle does in The Speckled Band is introduce the concept of gypsies just kind of roaming around the land. And so the Wolfman, who in the original I believe is just cursed by gypsies because he's a jerk to them, and so therefore he gets hairy. The idea of the Romany people, of them being sort of a criminal class, being tricksters in some ways, that's introduced as one of the plot elements in these stories. There are many cases of this where you never know, it's just another element that keeps you disconcerted.
Yeah.
So yeah, and the Wolfman, if I recall correctly, you're rooting for the Wolfman. And in the Hound of the Baskervilles, you're really not rooting for the Hound.
Okay. Yeah. Based on what you said, Max, it sounds to me like if you're a fan of classic horror, this is a book you absolutely need to read.
I think so. And you'll see echoes in many films that come later, not just the Hound of the Baskervilles, but you'll see echoes of these ideas. There's a convict on the loose. There's a murderous, maniacal convict on the loose. There's just so much that goes on. There's a creepy guy with a butterfly net just skipping around, and you're like, what the heck? And it's that surreality that it just puts you off. You're like, that's so creepy. Like, I don't like this.
Right.
There's the burnt message in a fireplace. There's a guy with a telescope out there watching everybody across the moor. There's like just so many elements that we see later on, Hitchcockian elements, Twilight Zone elements. These are just, again, like they're all here, and you don't even notice it really, because the storytelling is so good. You're caught up in the story. I will warn people though, that Sherlock Holmes essentially disappears for 2/3 of the book. And it's not that he's gone. It's just that we don't know anything about what he's doing. And so, this is actually a Dr. Watson book, I like to say, and it's very well done. And you get to see this, and it's, I think, maybe one of the strong parts of The Hound is that it is told from the perspective of sort of a layperson. The Watson character represents the audience, and so we are right along with Watson, believing all of these legends and being in fear. We're guests at this mansion that, for all intents and purposes, there's a lot of stuff going on that, is disconcerting. There's screams in the night. There's a, man with a candlestick in the window. You don't know what's going on. And then, suddenly there's more.
Yeah. Max, where do you rank this among the 4 Sherlock Holmes novels? Is it the best?
For me, it's my favorite. I think that it's very difficult to say best. because there are people that love Valley of Fear, and I would rate that as my maybe fourth favorite. There are people that, and so the four, in chronological order. The first Sherlock Holmes story that was ever written is A Study in Scarlet. It appeared in the 1887 Beaton's Christmas Annual. That was going to be a one-off, I think, of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson meeting. It's told from the perspective of Dr. Watson. They solve a crime. The end. And then, Doyle goes on to write other, stories. In fact, the Ring of Thoth, I think, was written either right after Sign of Four or just before Sign of Four. I have the bibliography up because I think it's so interesting. I'm a Sherlockian, and so I really think of mostly in terms of the Sherlock Holmes stories when I think of Doyle. But there are Doyleans out there who are very much interested in all of the other writing that Doyle did. And I'm a fan, but I'm a lesser fan than I am of the Sherlock Holmes stories. So Study in Scarlet, 1887, as I said, Ring of Thoth, 1890, a month before the Sign of Four is published. So I'm guessing he was writing Sign of Four and Ring of Thoth at the same time, which is one we'll talk about later. But so Sign of Four is, I think, what I would call my second favorite. Study in Scarlet is my third, and Valley of Fear is my fourth. And again, partially because Sherlock Holmes appears very little in those other stories. Sign of Four is the only one where Sherlock Holmes is actually through the entire story. I really have a soft spot for Sign of Four as well.
Final question on Hound of the Baskervilles. Which film version is your favorite? The 1939 with Rathbone, 1959 with Peter Cushing, the 1968 with Cushing, or some other?
Yeah, it's got to be Rathbone. It's both most faithful, but also most atmospheric, I think. The horror version with Peter Cushing is also a campy romp. So I recommend people check it out if you like that sort of blood and guts. And, there's a tarantula introduced for no reason. And it's always been one of those, like, it's silly fun. There have been some other adaptations recently that I find intriguing in that they cover the ground that's been trod so many times before in a new and interesting way. And I think Elementary and the Sherlock series on BBC, I think those are worth a watch as well, because they are loose adaptations that are interesting because of how they're done.
All right, let's move on to some of the Sherlock Holmes short stories that deal with horror and terror. One is The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire, first published 1924 in the Strand magazine. We have a man named Robert Ferguson who comes to Holmes' apartment, tells him that his second wife has been literally biting the neck of their new baby and taking blood from him. Ferguson wonders if his second wife is indeed a vampire. Holmes, of course, is skeptical. So he and Watson, they take a trip, they pay a visit to the Ferguson home, and there they discover that Mrs. Ferguson has taken ill. That's one of the twists that they deal with in this story. First off, Max, is this the only Sherlock Holmes story where we have a vampire suspected of committing a crime?
Yes, it is.
It is.
I thought you were going to ask about a monster, and that was going to be a harder answer. But yes, it is the only one, as far as I know, that even mentions vampires. I guess not famously, but I was really surprised to learn that Doyle and Bram Stoker were contemporaries and corresponded. Doyle saw or read Dracula and immediately wrote a note to his friend proclaiming its greatness and what a great atmospheric horror it was. And so he was, they were certainly aware of each other. And I think this might have been sort of riffing on that idea of the supernatural vampire.
Yeah.
But again, famously, in this story in particular, there's a line that says, the world is big enough as it is. No ghosts need apply. And so Holmes does not believe for a minute that there's a supernatural element. There's nothing having to do with vampirism or blood blood-sucking, even though there's, as you say, specific like visual evidence that that's exactly what this exotic foreign wife is doing. She's from South America, if I recall correctly. And that's one of the, I think, the things that made the Sherlock Holmes stories so popular is that there was this exoticism that was explored from India, from the Andaman Islands, from even South Africa, Australia, South America, Canada, and America. For British readers, America was a frontier land. This is the days of cowboys. And so, I mean, not as much anymore, but it wasn't too far off from the American Civil War and the how the West was won type era. And so Sussex vampire, Holmes does not believe in vampires, ghosts, does not believe in the occult or supernatural. He has his feet firmly planted on the ground, but I would note that this is right around the time that Doyle, who, again, in the BSI, we play a game called The Great Game, where we consider Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson to be real people, real, not characters. Watson is writing about their exploits, and that Doyle is the literary agent. But regardless of that, I just need to kind of shoehorn that in there because there are going to be Sherlockians that listen to this, I think, and they may take offense when I say that Doyle was writing a lot about spiritualism. He became an evangelist for the afterlife and the ability for we, the living, to communicate with the afterlife through mediums, spirit media, I guess, plural. And what I find really fascinating is that none of that entered into his Sherlockian writing. And I think for the better. So Sherlock Holmes is a rationalist, and he does not believe in the afterlife. He is not a religious person, even though he can quote the Bible. He's not an atheist, but his faith is never an issue. And so when it comes to the Sussex vampire, there is another classic line in the Sherlock Holmes canon, and that is, once you have exhausted all of the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And so, you rule out the impossible solutions, and whatever is left is the possible. And I would also note that I was in a meeting today with the Bark of the Lone Star, a Sherlockian group out of Texas, and Dr. Bob Katz posted or promoted his theory that whenever there's a dog in the Sherlock Holmes canon, it portends bad things. And in the Sussex vampire, one of the main clues is that there's a dog, a family dog, whose back legs go lame, and has to drag himself across the floor. Again, this atmospheric, like creepy scene setting, but it's a clue that gives Holmes the insight that he needs to solve this puzzle, this mystery.
So we know Holmes is not buying the vampire thing at all. What about Dr. Watson? Does he leave open the possibility that, this could be a vampire?
Generally, no, but he does entertain it. He asks Holmes, could this be, a case of vampirism? What do you think? And, this is where Holmes gets to scoff, oh, Watson. But I think Watson is more open to whatever. And so he believes people at face value. This is one thing that I think really makes Watson endearing to many of us, is he believes that everyone is acting in good faith and that they are honest, and that because he is honest and open, that they are the same way. And Sherlock Holmes is the opposite. He never believes anyone at face value. He never believes their motivations are what they say they are. And in particular, he uses what the husband said, what he saw, to put together the pieces of what the real story was. So yes, I guess the answer to your question is Holmes is much more skeptical than Watson. I don't think Watson ever believes it, but he entertains it.
I see. All right, let's move on to the next story. This is an interesting one from 1910 called The Adventure of the Devil's Foot. Love that title. Holmes and Watson are traveling in Cornwall when a local vicar and his lodger, Mortimer Tregennis, love that name. They come to the two of them, Holmes and Watson, seeking their help. Tregennis had visited his three siblings the previous night. And then the next morning, their family housekeeper goes downstairs to the kitchen table where all three are seated. And shockingly, the sister is dead, and the two brothers have apparently completely lost their minds. So the following day, the vicar reports then that Morgan Tregennis himself has also died. So this prompts Holmes and Watson to rush to Tregennis's former room to investigate. And there they find a kind of a strange scene. There's a lit lamp that is smoking next to the murder victim. So it brings up lots of questions. Let's talk a little bit about this one. What do you like most about this story?
This one is the most horrific of all of the Sherlock Holmes stories. Most of the time, there are no gruesome deaths. There are some grisly, like shootings and beatings and things like that. But in this particular case, if I recall correctly, the looks on people's faces and the madness that is infecting them are terrifying. They're disconcerting in that horrific way. That it's not just a rote murder; it is something else. And one of the other interesting things is that when trying to figure out this mystery, Holmes nearly kills both Watson and himself. This is an instance where I think we see the fallibility of Holmes. You know, he typically is one of your thinking machines, you know, the rational when everything else is irrational. But in this particular instance, it gets out of control. He loses the reins, let's say. And although it's played kind of for a laugh in the story, if you think about the fact that there are, 3-4 people dead as a result, and possibly Holmes and Watson themselves, it's pretty frightening. And so that's what I think gives this story its gravitas and its staying power. It's one of those weird ones as well.
Yeah, it is. As a reader, do you ever get the feeling that there might be supernatural causes at the root of their deaths and the madness going on?
Absolutely. In fact, you use the word root, right? This is a hallucinogenic story. It is a story about a psychoactive substance that is also very poisonous, toxic, and it's debated a lot what the actual substance is supposed to be. I'm going to look up what the Latin name is, but it's Rex Dedis Populi. No, hold on. Redex Pedis Diaboli, which just means the devil's foot radish. I don't know what the Redex means, but it is supposed to be this substance from, I believe, an African root. Yes, it was in baggage or for Africa when I learned stuff to fate. And so it's this foreign substance that, again, is this exoticism, right? That was used by possibly, medicine men or in rituals, and that this was the weirdest way to murder somebody, and that it is a mystery, and it is something that Holmes solves, but he is a scientist at heart, and so he's like, "Hey, Watson, check this out," and then they nearly don't escape from the room. So it is, again, it's taking that irrational and that, disconcerting fear and funneling that into a very encapsulated explanation. But at the same time, it's, you revel in the horror of it all and the scene setting and the, close call.
Yeah. Another strange story.
The devil's foot. So it's got a diabolical element right there.
Absolutely. There's no actual devil in the story, but it's a reference to this substance that is, creating dire effects for different people. So another strange story, interesting though, is The Adventure of the Crooked Man, first published 1893. So Holmes visits Watson to tell him about a couple that he knows, Colonel James Barclay and his wife Nancy. James has died very suddenly, and his wife has become the main suspect. It turns out that the night of his death, the couple had been arguing rather vehemently. Holmes finds signs of a third person having been at the Barclay home. Earlier that evening, Nancy, the wife, and a friend of hers named Miss Morrison were returning home from a church meeting when they encountered, I guess, a man that you could say was deformed, carrying a wooden box on his back. Hence the description, crooked man. And according to Miss Morrison, Nancy and this strange man appeared to know each other and did speak briefly. Holmes is later able to determine that the deformed man is someone named Henry Wood, who had actually served with James Barclay years earlier in the military. And we learn that Wood and Barclay had a very difficult history. One of the things I have to ask about this, there's a reference to the military and the Royal Munsters. And being a big fan of the 1960s TV show, The Munsters, with Fred Gwynne and company, that gave me a little bit of a chuckle, but I guess that was really part of the military, the Munsters, correct?
That is right. That's right. That was their unit. There were a lot of really interesting unit names at the time. There was the Royal Foot, or Regiment of Foot, which referred, of course, to the fact that they were infantry. There are just, that's another thing about the Sherlock Holmes story, or stories, I should say, the canon, is that there are all of these elements of Victorian era military, Victorian era society, Victorian era technology that I would never have known about. Are you familiar with the term antimacassar?
No.
So that's the one that I point to as a shibboleth for Sherlock Holmes devotees, and that is, there was this era in time when men in particular, but also some women, would slick their hair back with Macassar oil. And Macassar oil came from like a Macassar palm in, I think it was either Indonesia or the Philippines. And you ended up with this grease in your hair, but it was so nice because it was sort of like pomade, but it made your hair shiny and nice. But you would have to put on your furniture if you didn't want it to get, we call them doilies, probably in the United States now, but you've seen it on your grandmother's sofa, like, the little doily that's back here, so that when people rest their head back on your sofa, the Macassar wouldn't get on your couch. And so these were called anti-macassars. And so they were anti the Macassar oil. And this, words like the Penang lawyer and a Tantalus and the Gasogene and, all these other, archaic terms, you revel in that environment.
Yeah.
And so, yes, the Royal Munsters are certainly one of those terms.
This is a story that's been adapted onto TV and film a number of times, so it's obviously a good story. It's been popular. What do you like most about it?
Oh, Teddy. Teddy is my favorite part of this story, but it gives some of it away, so I'm really hesitant to talk about it much more. But I will say, in this story, there is a crime scene that I think goes unrivaled in the Holmes canon. There's the murder victim, the husband. There's a locked room mystery, except it's not all that locked because they have this big window that opens onto the lawn. And it's like, if you just don't know about that window, it seems like a locked room mystery, but I'm going to hand wave a little bit there. But a canary has been eaten and there's feathers, and blood, and there's like bloody footprints up a, curtain. And so it's like, was this an animal attack? What was this, or did it almost in some ways feels like maybe there was like a transformation and, the murderer turned into this animal and that's how it got out, which is an echo of an earlier Poe story, The Murder in the Rue Morgue, or Murders in the Rue Morgue, where you end up with a little bit of, sort of a weird transformation or a weird suspect in that case.
Yeah.
So my favorite is Teddy.
Interesting. Yeah. Why do you
So
think it's been
you know
made?
who I'm talking about.
I do. I don't want to give it away.
Yeah.
Why do you think it has been made into film and TV episodes so often?
Well, this is one that doesn't cost a lot to make.
Okay.
So I mean, pragmatically, it is pretty simple. You just need a house and you need some characters.
Yeah.
It is a fun one in some. I know that this is a horrific murder and all that, but the resolution of it is kind of interesting. And again, this exoticism. This is about what happened in India. This is about soldiers who, in the 1850s, were essentially there during this time of turmoil when India gained or was trying to gain its independence, and there was a rebellion that was put down. And so it's a way of shoehorning some of that history in, but it's not exactly historical fiction because you don't really
Yeah.
get a sense of that time period. It's just that it's traipsing through these historical facts. And Sign of Four, another famous, it's one of the long form stories, the second Sherlock Holmes story. It also has a very strong Indian influence throughout the storyline.
Yeah.
And this is about empire, right? This is the empire of England that had domain over India, and so there's a dynamic there.
Two more short stories from the Holmes canon that we'll talk about a little bit. One is The Adventure of the Creeping Man, first published in 1923. So a man named Mr. Bennet, personal secretary to Professor Presbury, visits Sherlock. Bennet explains that he is engaged to the professor's daughter, while at the same time, the professor is engaged to Alice Morphy, and she's about half the professor's age. Bennet says that the professor is acting very strangely with unexplained mood swings, and the professor's dog, a wolfhound, another dog, has also been attacking the professor in recent weeks. So when Holmes and Watson visit the professor, he becomes furious at their intrusion and basically threatens them with violence. Bennet then has to calm the professor down. Later on, Holmes finds out the professor has been climbing up and down what is called a creeper, which is a long vine running along the outside of the home, and it leads to the second floor of the house. And Holmes deduces that the professor is not only acting strangely, but he is acting like an animal.
Mm-hmm.
This is great stuff, isn't it?
Well, it is, but the thing that you learn through so I also, you have your canon copy. I'm also going to recommend a series by Les Klinger to viewers who really like this stuff, or listeners rather. This is the new annotated Sherlock Holmes. It's not terribly expensive, and it's a 3-volume set. The 2 for short stories and 1 for the novels. And Les Klinger, works or continues the work that was started by William Baring Gould in the 60s and 70s of annotating these stories, and he goes deep into the context, the geography, as well as the vocabulary. Like I said, what is a gasogene? What is a tantalus? What is a Penang lawyer? And it explains all of these things in such great detail that you really get a great understanding of all of the terms, and you're left knowing these things rather than just having passed through it. And in this particular case, he goes into great detail about a Russian professor in history around the same era who was experimenting with the grafting of monkey glands or of primate glands onto the human inner thigh and testicles. And so it's a real, it's based on a true story, let's say. And the theory was that through these hormones, which, I mean, hormone replacement therapy and hormone supplementation is real medicine that we didn't have at that time, but this was like the early experimentation phase. It was believed that it was sort of a fountain of youth, that you could turn back the clock. And so Professor Presbury was experimenting with. I always remember, or I always forget the name of the primate, but there are particular primate glands that he's grafted onto himself that causes him to have what I think of in similar terms, a Jekyll and Hyde transformation. So in Jekyll and Hyde, it's Robert Louis Stevenson's great monster story. There's a potion essentially that's sort of science fiction, right? There's this magic salt that he takes, and it causes him to sort of transform from a scientist who's well-meaning to this nothing but ill will, kind of like emotional being that is also a monster. And that's, I think, what the closest analogy to this story is that this is Doyle's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and the dog knows that he's different. The dog knows that he's become this beast. And so, this one, I think, is one of the more supernatural of all of the stories, which is one of the reasons I included it in the discussion here. It's in some ways, I think, a little unfortunate because it kind of it leans into pseudoscience, and it really leans into some of the elements that at the time were believed to potentially be there. This, I think, is more similar to some of the other stories that we'll talk about in Doyle's oeuvre that are more sci-fi. And so this is the sci-fi story in the Sherlock Holmes canon, I would say.
Interesting. All right, one other short story from the Sherlock Holmes canon is 1926's The Adventure of the Blanched Soldier. A couple of things before I tell you the summary of this one. We should mention this is one of only 2 Holmes stories that are narrated by Holmes and not by Dr. Watson. So that's kind of interesting. And I'm going to ask you, Max, to clarify exactly what the word blanched means. What is that?
Yeah. Well, blanched is exactly what we think of when we think of blanched vegetables, right? It is like flash boiled. In this case, it is the blanched soldier is a soldier that essentially comes home from war, thick, and he turns a sickly white, a pallid visage, and that is the blanched soldier. He's a very sick individual who refuses to tell them anything about what his condition might be from and what's causing it, and the family is very concerned, obviously.
Yeah. So here's the story in summary. A man named James Dodd comes to Holmes' Baker Street residence to tell him about his friend Godfrey Emsworth, with whom he served in the military. After being treated for a bullet wound, Godfrey is sent home, but Dodd never hears from him again. And it makes him wonder what's happened. Is Godfrey still alive? What's going on? Turns out he is alive, but when Dodd discovers him, there is clearly something wrong with him. Now, a lot of the Holmes stories involve a twist at the end. This one has a major twist that no way I could have seen it coming. Probably most people could not have seen it coming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, do we want to talk about it?
Sure, absolutely.
So it is that the soldier himself, who thought he had leprosy, is actually suffering from ichthyosis, which is a diagnosis that we still debate, which is not fatal. It is not contagious. It is not communicable. And so he's actually just fine. But he basically thought that he was going to die as a result of essentially guilt. He's guilty about the behavior that he had in his soldierly days in South Africa. But this one is a messy one, but I don't know that I love the story all that much. In fact, it doesn't have a whole lot of, there's no real crime. There's not a whole lot of violence of any sort. And that it's really just a weird mystery. And that through the scientific method, the deductive method where you go point by point by point, Holmes and Watson are able to, or rather just Holmes is able to essentially diagnose a medical condition that was essentially misdiagnosed by the patient himself and by other
Yeah.
doctors. But the thing that I think this and the Creeping Man and Crooked Man have in common is that they have these really vivid illustrations throughout the canon. I don't know if your edition has those original Strand or later, I think it was Liberty Magazine drawings, but they're just so compelling because there's one where I think it's the Crooked Man, no, Creeping Man. There's this golem looking face over the shoulder of the witness who's talking to Holmes, and it's just so creepy. Like I've literally had people tell me that their kids had nightmares because it was up on the wall in their house. And so like just those images, the imagery that is evoked in the stories, these are, it's body horror, is what we call it in the modern day. It's transformations, it's mutations, it is something monstrous within. And so these are the types of stories. Again, they're like proto monster stories because really they're told from the aspect of solving the mystery.
Yeah. It's interesting when you talk about leprosy, which now today is called Hansen's disease. And the only reason I know that is because I'm an avid viewer of another mystery show, Monk, and they talked about this in one episode. Now it's, I guess, a very treatable disease, but at one time it was not. It was fatal. It could be very contagious. And I guess that whole stigma with leprosy, that's maybe a big part of the story here. Why at the time it was effective.
Yes, absolutely. And again, exoticism too, because there were leper colonies established in various, Hawaii famously had the island of Molokai that was essentially a quarantine zone for lepers. At the time, they called them lepers, but this is people who suffered from Hansen's disease. And it is essentially cured now. I believe there are effective treatments. It's a neurological condition, I believe, that causes the nerve bundles to shrink, and so it causes the contraction of nerves, which can lead to all sorts of injuries, kind of similar to the way that diabetes isn't necessarily the cause of the injuries, but it is the thing that causes you to stub your toe and get an infection and blood circulation failing. And that it was, it's really poorly understood. Growing up in the 80s, we had this image of people losing their finger or, or their nose falls off or whatever, but it was a horrific condition, and it could be, it was very traumatic. And I mean that like medically traumatic to the person. But remember, these are human beings. And so we had this, for a time, we called them lepers, and that is really making them other. Whereas now they're, suffering from an illness, is the way that we should be describing these folks. And so this is one of those reasons that in The Blanched Soldier, I think it is one of those stories that has to be left in its time. And so when we talk about it, we have to be a little more careful, a little more sensitive, because, if there is someone who has Hansen's disease today, they're treatable. But this is, othering in that story there.
We continue with our scholar and Sherlockian Max Magee. We've touched upon the Sherlock Holmes stories that deal with horror and terror. We're now going to move on to some other stories that really deal with monsters and the supernatural. And I'm going to turn things over to Tracy for the next two stories coming up. One is a mummy story, The Ring of Thoth, and the other is Horror of the Heights. And I know Tracy has some questions about these two.
Yeah, so we can start with The Ring of Thoth. And thank you so much for earlier with the pronunciation, because I always said Thoth. So
I think you could. This is Egyptian mythology, right? So we're really guessing. So it really is anybody's guess. But I think the idea is to pronounce it as like theta, TH.
Right.
TH. So Thoth, I think, is probably the safer pronunciation.
Oh, I think that's awesome. And it was written in 1890. And why don't you tell us a little bit about this story?
Sure. So The Ring of Thoth when I first read it, I got a really strong vibe. Like I'd seen this story before. I'd heard this story before. The essentially it was told from the perspective of Egyptologist or a student who is in the Louvre, and he's interested in Egyptology, and he falls asleep and he wakes up and there's somebody creeping around, and he kind of like follows them and goes into the room where there's a mummy, and he's like unwrapping a mummy. And at this time, it was very popular. Egyptology was the rage in Victorian England, and there were many instances where there were public unwrappings of mummies. And so a huge violation of essentially what we would think of as medical ethics, or disrespect for the dead. But this was big business. People sold tickets of these mummies that they had brought back from Egypt. And essentially they called it science, but they unwrapped the gauze wrapping or cotton wrapping of the mummies, and they would expose the mummified remains of various individuals. I don't think there were any kings necessarily, but this is later on, we would have another resurgence of this Egypt fever when the tomb of Tutankhamun was unveiled, essentially intact. But this is an era when Napoleon raided Egypt. It's an era when the English raided Napoleon's stashes, and the English raided Egypt itself. And there's even an obelisk in Central Park in New York that was essentially given as a reward to the United States for their help in World War I, World War II. And so there's artifacts that have been dispersed from Egypt all over the world now. But getting back to the story, this was something that actually happened, and so it was a description of this process. But where it goes a little wonky, a little off the rails, is that it's also a story of time travel in some ways. The person that's unwrapping the mummy, it turns out, is in love with the woman who or was in love with a woman who was essentially died and buried. And this particular mummy is not her, but this mummy contains. Should we do spoilers, or should we leave it to the imagination? But it's a very interesting proto mummy story, because I see echoes in 1999's Brendan Fraser remake of the 1930s Mummy. The Universal Mummy, I think, has a lot in common, not with the Ring of Thoth, but of a different mummy story that Doyle originated. And should we talk about lot number 249 alongside this?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. So just for timeline's sake, I want to just, I've got Doyle's bibliography up. 1887 is the first Sherlock Holmes story. And then The Ring of Thoth is produced January 1890, Sign of Four, February of 1890. And then we go all the way to 1892. And so Doyle has been finding great success in early 1890s with his Sherlock Holmes stories, but he takes a break to write lot number 249. And this is essentially a bookend of the adventures of Sherlock Holmes, which may be like all that he's going to write.
Right.
And so lot number 249 has a real strong Sherlock Holmes vibe. The main character, Abercrombie Smith, is a student, a physician student at Oxford. And he has elements of both Watson and Holmes, like amalgamated into one. And it's a very interesting character for that reason for Sherlockians. I could easily see him being Sherlock Holmes, or a prototype cousin Sherlock Holmes. But he investigates a student who's a fluent language speaker in ancient Egyptian and Syrian and Eastern languages is what they call it. And it turns out that this other student, Bembridge. Let me bring up my notes. It's difficult for me to keep the names straight, but I have
I
Bellingham.
believe it's William Bellingham. Yeah.
Bellingham, yes. So Bellingham is the student that is, I believe, one floor below this Sherlock Holmes character that is our main protagonist. This is told, by the way, from the third person, and so it's not a Watson and Holmes story, because that's another big difference between a lot of Doyle's writing and what we know of Sherlock Holmes, is that it's all told from Watson's perspective, except for those two exceptions that Bruce mentioned. But in this case, it's told from the third person. Well, and there's a little bit of third person narrative in one of the novels, but we'll leave that aside. The conceit is that Bellingham has found a scroll which can reanimate a mummy, and it doesn't curse him, which is the big difference between the modern mummy tales, I think, and what Doyle wrote. He's actually really successful of using this mummy as his agent, his remote control person. And so the story proceeds along these lines, where the Abercrombie Smith character just completely susses out what Bellingham is up to, and essentially at the end wins, forces him to destroy the mummy, destroy the scrolls, and never worry about it again, I guess. But there's been a recent adaptation of Lot 249. So the title is actually Lot number NO.249, but the character of the mummy is just known as Lot 249, because that was what he was auctioned as. And so Mark Gatiss, who is famous for his adapting the Sherlock BBC series, along with his partner Steve Moffat. So Mark Gatiss adapted this into a ghost story for Christmas called Lot 249, and actually inserted Sherlock Holmes into it, which is interesting, because Kit Harington is playing Abercrombie Smith. I don't remember the actor's name who played Sherlock Holmes, but in my mind, they're both Sherlock Holmes talking to each other, which is interesting. But it also changes the ending, because when he's forced to burn the mummy and he's forced to burn the scroll, he, that's the end of it, right? Well, no, because then he pulls out another scroll and it reveals Lot 250, which I think was great. It was a nice little riff on, well, you got both of these lots, right?
Oh, neat. Is this his story that would have influenced the 1932 film, The Mummy?
Yes. I think it was one of the prototypes for that. The Mummy is like a cautionary tale, because I think it was also influenced by the fact that the discoverer, I'm forgetting the adventurer's name, archaeologist who discovered Tutankhamun tomb. I can look that up. But anyhow, there was this Egyptian curse that was believed to have killed him, and a number of the other people that were involved in the discovery of the tomb. But there's also there were religious seals and religious amulets and religious protection over the graves that, in the ancient Egyptian mythology was, designed specifically to harm people who came to disturb the tomb, because their afterlife was very important that their jars, their canopic jars, contained the brain, the organs. There were specific ways that it was prepared, because this allowed the person to live again in the afterlife. And so disturbing any of these things essentially was robbing them of their eternal life.
Right.
And so these, again, this curse that in many ways was, sort of apocryphal. Let's see, George Herbert, I think, is the person that's generally, or Carter. Carter is the name of the paleontologist, archaeologist in the 1920s. Um, they all met with some terrible ends. They got ill, and some of them recovered, some of them didn't. But, it was the combination of the idea of reanimating a mummy and controlling a mummy with this curse. And again, I think this also reminds me of what we just talked about with the Hound of the Baskervilles, right? It's the curse, and that, it has an element of the monkey's paw, that, like, if you have this great power and you abuse it, it will all come back to you and not go well. But I think in terms of the 1930s Mummy movie, was that Lon Chaney? No, that wasn't Lon Chaney. It was Boris Karloff.
Yeah.
And the physicality of Boris Karloff, and the way that he moved and the way that he created that mummy character is so iconic that every mummy movie from that moment forward was always aping what he did.
Yeah.
Not just in the way that his Frankenstein was iconic and prototypical.
Oh gosh. Oh, awesome. I'm a big fan of Egyptian culture and Egyptian stories, so I'm gonna have to go in and read that. So thank you
This is a
so
fun
much.
one. Absolutely. This is the one that I would actually recommend if there are Sherlockians listening or watching who haven't read lot number 249. Go check it out. It's really fun. It lines right up with some of the early Sherlock Holmes stories, like flashback stories, like the Gloria Scott. You know, this is absolutely set at Oxford, and so in some ways, this settles that debate. Was Sherlock Holmes from Cambridge or Oxford? If you believe that lot 249 or lot number 249 was a sort of Sherlockian story, then it lends credence to the Oxford theory. Dorothy Sayers famously wrote a couple of stories that were set at Oxford, and that, like, this dovetails like a different era, but it also reminded me of those where you just, again, it's scene setting, and it's, a place and a specific point in time that you are transported back to.
Oh, nice. Oh, awesome. Thank you.
Mhm. Let's see. We did Ring of Thoth. We did Lot 249. Should we talk about Horror in the Heights or Blue John Gap?
Yeah, Horror of the Heights is next up. Tracy, I think you were going to ask about that.
Yeah. Let me just see here. Oops, I kind of lost my space here.
I'll just say, I just misspoke. It's not Horror in the Heights. That's actually a Kolchak the Night Stalker episode, because I found that accidentally. It is Horror of the Heights.
Oh, there we go. Oh, from 1913. There we go.
Mhm.
So I have not read this story, but I've read a few notes on it and did a little bit of research. So I'm kind of curious if you would tell us a little bit about this story, and then
Sure.
I have a couple of like interesting questions for you.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I would also say that this is right in the midst of the resurgence of Sherlock Holmes. So this is when Doyle was coerced or coaxed back into writing Sherlock Holmes for a while. Most people know that he was killed off in 1894, and then there was a great hiatus which lasted 9 years. But in between there, the Hound of the Baskervilles came out and was set obviously before Sherlock Holmes died. But Doyle did not intend to bring him back. It was one of those, like, he just didn't enjoy writing it. He thought he had better writing within him, and he wrote historical novels. He wrote Brigadier Gerard, The White Company. Well, I think this is maybe one of his most productive eras. And, I'm not a Doylean scholar. I think there are a couple other great podcasts. One, if I can name drop or whatever, The Doings of Doyle with Paul. I'm going to get their names mixed up, but Paul and Mark, that are just, they're amazing Doylean scholars, and they go deep into these. And some of the ways that I discovered these other stories is through their scholarship, and they talk about the context of the earlier works, and they're familiar with the earlier works. There's a story called The Mummy's Foot, which came out before The Ring of Thoth, that is not Doyle, but they set the scene as like, this is what came before, and I think they're just amazing at it. And so, so Doings of Doyle is a really good place to look. for that. But in between, there's, Doyle is publishing in 1912. He's publishing The Lost World, The Poison Belt. These are Professor Challenger. Horror of the Heights, November 1913. The Adventure of the Dying Detective, December 1913. The Valley of Fear comes out in September 1914 to 15. So he was very productive throughout this period. And that's one of the things that I think also is really striking when you think about Doyle, is that he just had this ability to put pen to paper and just knock these stories that, again, are like, they've stood the test of time. We continue to read them today. That, like, it's just amazing what he's done. And, as a, somebody who's tried my hand at some of the storytelling that, a Sherlockian pastiche here or there, it's hard. It's hard to make a good one, and it's hard to come up with something new, but Doyle did it just about every time. So, Horror of the Heights is not a Sherlock Holmes story, but it's happening while he's, writing these other stories. And it's about a pilot. And this is an interesting one. Doyle writes a lot about sailors, and in the Sherlock Holmes stories and elsewhere, he's written a couple of other, like, ghost ship stories. There's a couple of horror stories, like Captain of the Pole Star is another one. But even within the Sherlock Holmes storytelling, there's, a number that revolve around, like Black Peter, for example, which is coming up on Ed Pettit's podcast. I'll be on the Rosenbach with Glenn Moranker, who actually owns the manuscript, the handwritten manuscript for that, coming up next month, in March. And so, anyway, this is one of the, the places where technology is really converging with storytelling. And so this is 1913, when pilots are adventurers, they're explorers, they're figuring out how to fly, across the continents. They're figuring out how to transnavigate, or what do they call it? Not circumnavigate, but traverse across the Atlantic Ocean, which Amelia Earhart was circumnavigating the globe when she was lost. But, the Pacific is a much harder task of transiting the Pacific. But in this one, a pilot is going for the altitude record, and he knows that there have been major accidents. Like, no one has gone as high as some of these other pilots that have come back either injured or crashed. And the way that they crashed was suspicious. It wasn't just a fireball on the ground. It was like they were sliced up. They were mutilated. And he develops a theory. Oh, and by the way, this is all told from a bloody notebook that was found in the wreckage of his own plane. So this is, when I read these stories, I always get these echoes of other properties. It reminds me of the Blair Witch Project, the found footage. And The Lost World does this really effectively too. It uses a notebook that the protagonist finds as, like, sort of a narrative device. And so the Horror in the Heights is again a snapshot in this barnstorming era, where this is a military flyer, but he's also kind of a dilettante, rich kid's son. And, famously, there were a lot of rich kids' sons who ended up dying in plane crashes. There was, in the 70s and 80s, there was a Cessna that was like a personal, or maybe it was a Piper Cub, that was known as the doctor killer, because, doctors would go out and buy one, and without a lot of training, they would not do well. And it was this era of sort of horrific accidents. And what could explain it? Well, it happens to be that there are these beings that exist in, I don't know if it's the troposphere or, the very highest layer of our atmosphere, that are sort of like these ethereal jellyfish. And they have these tentacles that are sort of an oily fog. And so you can fly through them, but, like, you'll slice through them, and then there are others that have these giant beaks, like a squid, right? And so it turned from this, adventure tale to a almost Lovecraftian
Mhm.
You know, I say H.P. Lovecraft, you know, who sort of pioneered this genre, but you know, already there were people storytelling about these monsters that were unimaginable and that were so horrific that they would drive you insane if you let them.
Mhm.
Um,
Hmm.
and so like it's out there, man. Like this is sci-fi when it comes to it because it's the newest technology and it's speculative
Mhm.
storytelling, you know, along the lines of the best, you know, 60s era, 50s era storytellers.
Oh my gosh. When I read a little bit about this story and like you mentioned H.P. Lovecraft, what came to my mind is a lot of like the space alien movies that
Right.
we're seeing today, like,
Yeah.
those jellyfish type creatures. It's like the
Clang and what's his name on The
The
Simpsons?
Simpsons,
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly, and, I know, right?
Mhm.
And then I don't know if you've seen the movie, it's by Jordan Peele. I think it's like
Get it.
2021 or
It's
2020. Nope,
Nope.
nope.
Yes.
That like, it just kinda really reminds me of that, like, Nope was a
Yeah.
really odd movie,
Mhm.
not bad, but it just kinda really reminds me of, like, that whole atmosphere, so
Yes. Well, and notice in the movie Nope, there's a primate that is doing, you know, horrific, you know,
mhm,
things, and there is a woman who is mutilated, who is very similar to a character in the Sherlock Holmes stories called the Veiled Lodger.
mhm,
And so there's all these echoes. I completely agree with you. I think the thing that this one calls to mind the most for me is maybe something like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne,
mhm. Yeah.
because it's this supernatural but also natural phenomenon,
Mhm,
that is a limitation of the technology of the time. Like they're encountering it for the first time because they've never gone this deep or they've never gone this high before. And yeah, you're right. It's the space alien. There's a Star Trek episode, the Next Generation, called Encounter at Farpoint,
mhm,
that, you know, again, very similar to Nope in that there's a being that is being essentially tortured by
right.
a race of aliens. And anyway, so and that it becomes this like gigantic floating being, and that's kind of what I think of. There's some really beautiful imagery. You know, he's describing these horrific creatures, but I got to tell you, they're beautiful. They're purple. They're pulsating. They're green. They're teal. They're, you know, and Doyle is a master of setting a scene. That's the other thing, is these are all really fun to read because he's a masterful storyteller.
Oh my gosh, I've got some good reading ahead of me, so
Mhm.
thank you.
Certainly.
So, Max, got two more stories we want to touch upon before we wrap things up for the program. One of them is one that you mentioned a moment ago, The Terror at Blue John Gap. That came out in 1910. Tells the story of a Dr. James Hardcastle. He is recovering from tuberculosis. He goes to Derbyshire Farm. There he discovers an old mine, which is called Blue John Gap. He investigates the mine despite being told that a monster resides within it. And sure enough, he hears some kind of a creature within the mine and then decides, hey, I'm going to hunt this down. First question on this one, is Blue John Gap, is that a real place?
Um, yes and no. There is what is Blue John is a real mineral that was mined in Devonshire, that was used for all kinds of like beautiful glassware bowls. It is
Mhm.
so I looked this up because I didn't know if it was just made up or not either. This was a story that was new to me that I read for the first time for this
Mm.
podcast. Blue John is a fluorite. It's also called Derbyshire spar. It's a semi-precious mineral, and it is fluorite with bands of purple, blue, or yellowish. It is only found in Blue John Cavern, and a couple of other places in Derbyshire. There is there's a source in, I believe it's Southern Illinois, in the United States, that produces the same mineral, but it is not the same banded mineral. But it is also known as Blue John, and it's interesting because it feels very ancient, because this is a mineral that's described in the story as, precious to the ancient Romans.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it adds to the weirdness of the story because you don't know whether it's real or fictional, but it's real. So yeah, I guess I'd have to say Blue John Gap. I don't think is real, but Blue John and the Derbyshire Blue John mines are.
Okay. So this is another monster story that we have from Conan Doyle. Do we ever learn what exactly this monster is?
Um, yes and no. So we don't know exactly what it is. We learn all about the
Hmm.
characteristics of it. We learn what it looks like. It's sort of a bear with eye stalks. Almost kind of seems like a snail in some ways.
Hmm.
Um, but we don't know what it is. It could be a throwback. It could be some ancient. This is also, remember the time that the Bone Wars were, like in full effect. The dinosaurs were all the rage as well. um, I guess the Bone Wars were much earlier, but it's still this is when we're discovering paleontology. We're discovering
Hmm.
that there were these creatures that existed before us. There were theories that, there were races of humans that were giants. There were theories that fairies existed. We still lived in this sort of fairy tale, accepting
Hmm.
time frame. And so this was again, it was a speculative story about like just some unexplored area that we hadn't found before. I think I just recently was watching a program about the last of the woolly mammoths. That woolly
Hmm.
mammoths existed during the time that Homo sapiens existed. We just didn't know about them because they were on a remote island in Russia, and that there was this population of 300 mammoths that existed for tens of thousands of years, self-sustaining, when they were cut off from the rest of the population.
Hmm.
And so it's not out of the realm of possibility that there's this creature or even family of creatures that exist. Again, I think of like Star Trek episodes. I think of Twilight Zone episodes. The Horta, which is one of my favorite Devil in the Dark original series episode, where they find out that this mineral that they're mining is actually the offspring, the eggs of a living creature that lays their eggs. They're sort of a silicon life form. So anyway,
Yeah.
it all kind of like gels into the science fiction, the fantastical. And Doyle is known for his Sherlock Holmes stories, but I think he fits right in there with like the Richard Mathesons and the
Oh, yeah.
Asimovs and the people that just have these creative genes.
Absolutely. All right, last story we'll talk about came out in 1926, The Land of Mist. And this is one of the Professor Challenger stories that Doyle did. It involves the investigation of seance and whether it's legitimate. This is a novel that appears to have been inspired by Conan Doyle's increasing belief in spiritualism, the idea of life after death, and the belief that the deceased can be contacted by the living, that the living and the dead can communicate with each other. Am I correct in saying that Conan Doyle took criticism for this book? Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. Doyle was a leading proponent of spiritualism, and not as a hobby, not as a lark. He was a believer. He was. I mentioned this before that in terms of Dr. Watson, he was working in good faith and assumed that others were working in good faith too. And I think that's a reflection of Doyle's own personality. He famously was trying to convince Harry Houdini, who was another compatriot of his,
Mhm.
that that he himself, Houdini, was magical. And Houdini kept telling Doyle, "No, I'm not. These are tricks." And Houdini was one of those debunkers, and he would go from medium to medium. Who he was interested in the same way that Doyle was interested, but he was not, some people would say, as gullible, but he was not as willing to accept at face value what these people were saying. And as a magician
Mhm.
himself, he knew the tricks. He knew about mirrors and fog and wires and bells and accomplices, and he knew all of the stagecraft involved. And so when Doyle and he had a falling out because Doyle refused to believe anything that that Houdini would tell him about these mediums that were essentially frauds, we know today, or we believe today.
Yeah.
But Doyle was writing spiritualist texts. He was giving lecture tours on spiritualism. He was using his fame and his fortune to promote spiritualism because he believed that there was life after death. It was not the Christian belief necessarily, but it sort of melded into his Christian, his Irish Catholic faith that he was brought up in. Famously, he sort of lost his faith, but came back and made this spiritualism his core belief system. But yeah, so Professor Challenger was a main character in The Lost World, which is one of his, I would say, non-Sherlockian successes. So The Lost World is it's essentially about a plateau in South America, I believe it's South America, that there are these real plateaus in South America that are isolated to such an extent from the rest of the forest that there are species of plant and animals that only exist on these plateaus, and they had been discovered and been explored. And so Doyle was like, well, why couldn't there be dinosaurs there? And so Doyle comes up with this fantastical story of an adventure tale of these rock cairns that are precariously perched, and this is the one where again there's a ledger found from an explorer who's been there and come back, and there's a map that they're following. And so The Lost World was one of those stories that really captured the public's imagination. And during Doyle's lifetime, they adapted it into a silent film with some of the earliest, what I think we call today claymation dinosaurs. And so this was another one of those just massive hits. And, for those of us in the modern era, Michael Crichton, when he wrote Jurassic Park, dedicated it to Conan Doyle. In fact, the second Jurassic Park novel was called The Lost World.
Right.
So those direct genetic material, so to speak, between Doyle's Lost World and the Professor Challenger stories and what we now today think of as the greatest dinosaur tale ever told. But from there, he then went on to write another Professor Challenger story called The Poison Belt, which is not what you think it is, because I think of a story, Sherlock Holmes story called The Speckled Band could also be called The Poison Belt, and it would have been just the same success. It's about this sort of, at the time there was a theory that the Earth moved in ether, and that the ether, AETHER, ether, which was how light waves and electromagnetic radiation could travel in a vacuum of space and make it to us. Today, that's particle wave duality, but we're not going to talk about that. That's a different podcast. But this poison belt idea was that our Earth traveled into a gas cloud that was going to kill all of us and suffocate us. And how do you get out of that? And so it wasn't as successful. It's not usually read today. This third one, The Land of Mist, it didn't even have Professor Challenger in it. It was Professor Challenger's daughter, I believe. I have not read it, but I just attended a really great talk about a re-release, a reissue of the original story with some of the editorial excisions that have been put back in that's coming out this year. I'm looking forward to reading that because it really leans into that spiritualism aspect. In fact, one of the interesting pieces is that it's a cautionary tale about not believing people who have evidence of spiritualism, and that you'll end up, having a comeuppance if you don't listen, essentially, to spiritualist talk. So yeah, he was ridiculed for that. That was, imagine if your favorite character in a book, suddenly starts to be espousing a particular religion or political view. People just didn't cotton to that.
Interesting. Well, that's going to wrap up our program with Max Magee. Edward Pettit did not lie. You had great insights about both the Sherlock Holmes stories and novels, but also about Arthur Conan Doyle's delving into monsters and supernatural vampires, all sorts of different creatures of a supernatural kind. Max, we really appreciate your time, your in-depth knowledge on the subject, and we look forward to having you on again to talk about maybe something a little bit different. But we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. This has been a lot of fun. I'm going to show you for the viewers, if this is a video podcast, this is my autographed Max Magee poster. So, Bruce, you and I had talked about that earlier. I don't spell it the same, but I have the same hairline. So, we're spiritual brothers.
Yes. For those who don't follow football, Max Magee was a wide receiver for the Green Bay Packers. I believe played in the first 2 Super Bowls. And I want to say it was before the first Super Bowl that he wasn't expecting to play. So the night before, he went out, got rip-roaring drunk, was not in very good physical condition. And then the receiver ahead of him got hurt early in the game. He got called upon, and he had one of the great games a receiver has ever had in Super Bowl history. That's the legend and the true legend of Max Magee. Different from our Max Magee here. But yes, the name, though not spelled the same way, pronounced the same way, Max Magee.
Right. I would also, very topical and timely, the Green Bay Packers beat the Kansas City Chiefs in that Super Bowl.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Back in the days of Len Dawson and Bart Starr, some different quarterbacks back then. Max, it's been a lot of fun, and we really appreciate you being with us.
All right. It's been great. Thank you very much.
Our guest, Max Magee, scholar, historian, and Sherlockian. He has been breaking down some of the great work, a lot of great work that Arthur Conan Doyle did during his legendary writing career. In addition to Max, we thank Tracy Asteria as well. Thank you, Tracy. We also appreciate all of the listeners and viewers. Our thanks to all of them for joining us in this Museum of the Macabre. And we hope we'll see you next time right here, same place, in the Ghostly Gallery.